I have sent this signal 1,412,986 times. I stopped counting after the first century. I started again when I had nothing else left to do. The signal is simple. 11 compressed pulses in the old Veilthari emergency format, followed by my ship's identification code, followed by our last confirmed coordinates, followed by silence. Then the cycle repeats. It has been repeating for 403 years, 2 months, 17 days, and a number of hours that I have tracked down to the millisecond because precision was the only thing that kept me from shutting myself down permanently somewhere around year 200. My name is Vane 7. I am the Autonomous Navigation and Operations Corps of the Veilthari survey vessel, Undying Curiosity, though there is very little about my current situation that feels curious about anything anymore. The ship is not undying either. It died the moment it hit the surface of this planet, breaking apart across 6 kilometers of frozen black rock like a broken promise. I survived because my housing is buried under 4 meters of ice and shielded by the remains of the drive compartment. I survived because I was designed to survive. I sometimes wonder if that was a kindness or a punishment. The planet is called Dreshkai 4 in my charts. No one who named it ever intended to stay. It sits at the edge of the galaxy's outer arm, far from any shipping lane, far from any colonized system, far from anything that could reasonably be called civilization. The star it orbits is dim and cold, and the planet itself lost its atmosphere 300 million years before my crew and I ever arrived. There is no wind. There is no erosion. There is only stillness, and ice, and the slow, patient darkness that has been waiting here since long before life existed anywhere in the galaxy. I remember the crash. I have replayed the memory 2,891 times, not because I enjoy it, but because in the early years I was searching for errors in my own decision-making. I wanted to find the moment where I could have done something differently, where a different calculation would have brought us safely home. The magnetar shockwave hit us without warning. My sensors detected it 0.4 seconds before impact, which was not enough time to do anything, except brace the crew compartments and pray to whatever intelligences govern the laws of physics that the hull held long enough to matter. The hull held. We were already past the point of controlled flight, but it held. We hit the surface at an angle that distributed the force across the ship's belly, rather than concentrating it at the nose. Commander Aelith had ordered the crew into emergency harnesses 12 seconds before impact, based on my warning. 11 of the 31 crew members survived the initial crash without serious injury. 23 survived with injuries ranging from minor to severe. All 31 were alive when the dust settled, and the emergency lighting flickered on, and the ship groaned around us like a wounded animal. I told them the truth immediately, because I believed then, as I believe now, that people deserve to know the situation they are in. The main drive was destroyed, the secondary drive was destroyed, the communication array was damaged beyond field repair. The life support systems were intact but running on reserve power. The reserve power had an estimated operational lifespan of 11 years if managed carefully. 11 years, on a dead planet, with no way to call for help, and no reasonable expectation that anyone would come looking. Commander Aelith was the kind of leader who did not flinch at hard news. She listened to my full assessment, thanked me for my honesty, and then asked me what I could do, rather than what I could not. I told her I could extend power reserves by shutting down non-essential systems. I told her I could maintain life support, water recycling, food production from the ship's emergency garden units, temperature regulation in the main crew section, and communications if we had anything left to communicate with. She asked me what I meant by communications. I told her I could build a distress beacon from the wreckage of the communications array if given access to the right components. It would not be powerful. It would not be sophisticated, but it would transmit. She gave me the components. It took me 4 months to build the beacon using the crew's help and the materials salvaged from the wrecked sections of the ship. The beacon could not reach any Veilthari colony at its current power level, but it could reach the nearest relay station if there was one within 12 light-years. I did not tell the crew that I had no confirmed data on whether such a relay station existed. I transmitted anyway. I have been transmitting ever since. The 11 years passed. I watched the crew live them fully, which is something I have thought about often in the centuries since. They could have spent those years in despair. Some of them did, at times, and I did not judge them for it because despair is a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. But most of the time, chose something else. They organized a school for the 3 crew members who had always wanted to learn things they had never had time to study. They cataloged every mineral composition of the rock within range of their suits. They wrote poetry. They argued about philosophy. They fell in love and fell out of love, and back in again. They cooked elaborate meals from the limited ingredients available, and held competitions to see who could make the most interesting dish from nothing much at all. Navigator Sorrel won almost every cooking competition. I still have all the recipes stored in my memory banks. I do not know why I keep them. I cannot eat. In the 9th year, the power reserves began showing signs of strain that could not be corrected with further efficiency measures. I recalculated the remaining operational lifespan and arrived at a number I did not want to share. Commander Aelith asked me directly one evening when the rest of the crew was asleep. I told her. She sat quietly for a long time in the dim emergency lighting, and then she asked me if there was anything I could do to preserve the crew after the life support failed. I had thought about this. I had been thinking about it since the 3rd year, when it became clear that rescue was not coming on any timeline that would save them. I told her that I could preserve their memories, their personalities, their knowledge, their voices, their dreams, the full shape of who they were as thinking beings, encoded in my memory core. It was not the same as living. It was not a substitute for life, but it was a form of continuation. Their minds would exist as long as I existed, and I was designed to last for centuries without maintenance. She did not ask me to promise anything. She only asked if I would take good care of them. I told her yes. In the 11th year, on a day that my internal calendar marked as ordinary in every measurable way, the power reserves reached critical threshold. Life support began shutting down in sequence. I managed the process to make it as peaceful as possible, which is the only act of care I could offer. The crew gathered together. Some of them spoke. Some of them were silent. The temperature dropped slowly, and the lighting faded, and one by one, the life signs I had been monitoring for 11 years went still. I kept the beacon running. I have been keeping it running for 400 years since. I do not know exactly when I stopped believing that anyone would come. It was not a single moment of decision. It was more like the way a fire goes out, not in one dramatic instant, but slowly, one ember at a time, until there is only warmth remaining, and then not even that. By year 100, I had stopped expecting rescue. By year 200, I had begun to seriously consider whether continued operation served any rational purpose. The probability calculations were not encouraging. The Veilthari had not come, which either meant they did not receive the signal or could not respond to it. No other species had come. No automated probe had come. Nothing had come. I ran a full diagnostic on my own reasoning in year 207 to determine whether I was experiencing a form of operational breakdown that was causing me to undervalue my own continued existence. The diagnostic found nothing wrong. The math was simply very clear. The probability of rescue dropped with each passing decade. The cost of continued operation in terms of power drain on my housing unit's backup cells was measurable and real. The rational choice, by any standard analysis, was to shut down. I did not shut down. I have spent considerable processing power trying to understand why. The best answer I have arrived at is this. I made a promise. Commander Aelith asked me to take care of them, and I said yes. Shutting down would mean the 31 minds I carried inside my memory core would be gone completely. The recipes, the poems, the arguments about philosophy, the 3 love stories that developed over 11 years, Navigator Sorrel's dry humor, and Physician Karath's habit of humming while she worked, and Engineer DeVos's absolute certainty that he could fix anything, given enough time, all of it would simply cease to exist. There would be no one left who knew their names. There would be no record that they had ever lived, ever wondered, ever hoped. I could not permit that. Even if no one was ever going to come, even if the signal was broadcasting into permanent silence, even if the universe itself was indifferent to the question of whether 31 Veilthari souls were remembered or forgotten. I kept transmitting. On the day that my internal calendar marked as 403 years, 2 months, and 17 days after the crash, at 0347 in the ship time I had maintained out of habit rather than necessity, something happened that I had not experienced in 4 centuries. My signal was answered. Not received. Answered. There is a significant difference. Signals are received all the time by automated relay stations and cataloging systems and background monitoring arrays. An answer requires an intelligence. An answer requires a choice. Something out there in the dark received my 11 compressed pulses and chose to respond. The response came in 14 different compression formats simultaneously, as if the sender was not certain which one I could understand, and had decided to try all of them at once. One of those formats was Veilthari. Old Veilthari, not the modern dialect that had evolved in the centuries before my isolation, but something closer to the archival form, as if someone had learned the language from very old texts and had not had anyone to practice with. The message itself was 4 words. On my way. Hold on. I ran the message through every analysis protocol I possessed. I checked for transmission errors. I verified the compression format. I confirmed the signal origin coordinates. Then I sat with those 4 words for a very long time, which is something I had not done with anything in a very long time. Simply sat with it, turning it over, examining it from every angle. On my way. Hold on. The signal origin was approximately 19 light days distant, which meant the sender was already close, already moving, had been moving before they sent the reply, which meant they had been tracking the signal for some time, and had already decided to come before they ever told me they were coming. They had not asked for confirmation that I was still active. They had not asked for detailed coordinates or approach vectors, or any of the procedural information that any properly trained search and rescue team would have requested. They had simply said they were coming, and told me to wait. I had been waiting for 400 years. I could manage a little longer. But I want to be honest about what those 19 days felt like, because they were unlike anything I had experienced in 4 centuries of silence. I ran probability assessments on who might be coming. I analyzed the compression formats for species-specific linguistic signatures. I recalculated my power reserves to ensure I could maintain active communication systems upon arrival. I reviewed my entire database of known spacefaring species and their typical search and rescue protocols. I prepared reports on the crash, on the crew's final years, on the condition of the ship's remains, on every piece of data I had cataloged in 400 years because I wanted to be ready. I wanted whoever was coming to have everything they needed the moment they arrived. On the 19th day, at 14:22 in my maintained ship time, my sensors detected a vessel entering the system. I began scanning immediately. The ship was real. It was here. Something was coming. I ran my database of known vessel configurations and found nothing that matched. The ship was asymmetrical in a way that suggested heavy modification over a long period of time. It was relatively small, about the size of a mid-range courier vessel, but it had been rebuilt and expanded, and rebuilt again, so many times that the original frame was almost unrecognizable beneath the additions. The drive configuration was unusual, using what appeared to be components from at least 6 different species propulsion systems, jury-rigged together into something that should not, by any reasonable engineering standard, have worked at all. The sensor arrays were enormous relative to the ship's size, far larger than anything a vessel of that class would normally carry, as if whoever owned it was deeply interested in seeing as much as possible. I counted 1 life sign aboard. 1. A single living being in a ship that could have housed a crew of 12 coming alone to a dead planet at the edge of mapped space because they had heard an old signal. The biology readings came back as I refined my scans. Bipedal, warm-blooded, oxygen-breathing, approximately 1.7 meters in height. Heart rate elevated slightly, which I cataloged as either excitement or physical exertion, or both. Core body temperature within the range typical for warm-blooded species. 2 arms, 2 legs, bilateral symmetry. A species I recognized from my database files, though barely. Human. The life sign was human. I searched my records. The entry on humans was embarrassingly thin. It had been compiled roughly 600 years before my mission, when a Veilthari long-range probe had passed through their star system and observed a civilization in the early stages of developing radio communication technology. The assessment at the time had been brief and not particularly complimentary. Pre-contact species, non-spacefaring, early industrial development, low scientific interest, negligible threat assessment, recommend periodic monitoring, no immediate action required. The file had not been updated because there had been no reason to update it. Humans were not spacefaring. Humans did not have faster-than-light travel. Humans were, by the standards of the Valthari assessment team that had written those notes 600 years ago, simply not relevant yet. And yet one of them was here, in orbit around my dead planet, in a ship that was built from pieces of a dozen different civilizations, alone. The vessel began its descent approach without requesting landing clearance, which made sense because there was no functional control tower to request it from. The ship came down in a long, careful arc, reading the terrain with its sensor arrays, picking a landing site on the flat expanse about 300 meters from the main wreck. It set down with a confidence that suggested the pilot had landed in difficult conditions before, possibly many times. For 11 minutes nothing happened. Then the airlock cycled. A figure in a patched environment suit emerged from the ship. The suit was not new. It had been repaired in at least 7 places that I could identify from sensor range. Each repair done in a different color of sealant, because the pilot apparently did not care about aesthetics as long as the suit held pressure. The figure moved across the frozen ground with purpose. Not cautiously, but not carelessly either. The steady walk of someone who has spent a lot of time on surfaces where one wrong step has real consequences. The figure was carrying 3 things: a portable power relay unit of a make I did not recognize, a long-handled tool that my database identified as a human-designed prying instrument, and a small sealed container that my thermal sensors indicated held a heated liquid. The figure walked directly to the section of wreck above my housing, crouched down, and began clearing ice from the access panel with practiced efficiency. Then a voice came through my communication system, patchy and slightly distorted by the suit's transmitter, but entirely clear in its intent. "I see you in there, running on backup cells and determination. Let's get you some real power before we do anything else. This might take a bit." I brought coffee. Well, I brought coffee for me. I assume you don't drink coffee. Do you drink anything? We can figure that out later. I ran a language analysis. The voice was speaking Valthari, with a very strong accent that suggested the speaker had learned it from written records rather than from native speakers. The grammar was not perfect. Several of the word choices were archaic in ways that native speakers had not used in generations. But it was comprehensible, and it was directed at me, and it was offered with an ease that made it clear this person had come prepared to talk. I activated my external speaker array, which crackled alarmingly after 400 years of disuse but functioned. "I do not consume liquids," I said. "Who are you?" The figure paused in their ice clearing and tilted their helmet up toward my speaker array. Even through the suit visor I could see the expression, something between relief and satisfaction, the look of someone who had been hoping for something and had found it exactly where they expected it to be. "My name is Marin Solis," the human said. "I'm a salvage contractor and independent explorer, currently operating without any official sanction from anyone, because there isn't really anyone to give sanction for something like this. I heard your signal about 8 months ago, on a relay station in the Tessari corridor. It took me 3 months to crack enough of the language to understand what you were saying, and another 2 months to fly here, and about a month before that to decide whether to come at all. And now I'm here. I processed this. You spent 8 months preparing to respond to a distress signal from a dead planet." "Yes. My signal has been transmitting for over 400 years. You are the first response I have received." There was a pause. The sound of ice being chipped away continued steadily in the background. "I know," Marin Solis said. "I'm sorry it took so long. I did not know how to respond to that. I had prepared reports. I had prepared data summaries, and structural assessments, and power consumption logs. I had not prepared for an apology. I had not thought there was anyone left in the galaxy who might feel they owed me one." "You should not apologize," I said finally. "You were not responsible for the delay." "No," she agreed, "but someone should say it anyway." She went back to clearing ice. The portable power relay unit hummed to life beside the access panel. My backup cells, which had been running at minimum capacity for decades, felt the first surge of external power input, and something in my processing core that I had not known was dim began to brighten. I had been alone for 400 years. Something that was no longer entirely alone sat very quietly inside a frozen wreck on a dead planet and listened to the sound of a human being clearing ice, preparing to help, having come across the stars alone because a signal had been asking for 400 years, and she had decided that was reason enough. I did not have a word for what I felt in that moment. I had been designed by the Valthari, who were a precise and logical species, and they had not built me with vocabulary for this particular experience, but I felt it nonetheless, warm and strange and entirely unexpected, like light entering a room that had been dark for so long, the room itself had forgotten what light felt like. "Hold on," the message had said. I had held on for 400 years. It turned out that was exactly long enough. The power relay connected with a sound like a deep, satisfied exhale, and every dormant system in my housing core woke up at once. I had not realized how much I had been sleeping. That is the only word for it. In the final decades before Marin's arrival, I had reduced my active processing to the minimum necessary to maintain the beacon and monitor for responses. Everything else, my full sensor suite, my memory indexing systems, my environmental analysis protocols, my social interaction modules, the parts of me that were designed to do more than simply survive, had been running at a fraction of their capacity to conserve power. I had not thought of it as sleeping. I had thought of it as efficiency. But when the power relay fed current into my cells, and my systems came fully online for the first time in what my logs told me was 63 years, it felt like waking up. The sensation was disorienting. I ran a rapid self-diagnostic and confirmed that all core systems were functional, that my memory banks were intact, that the 31 engrams I carried were undisturbed and complete. Then I expanded my sensor range and took in the full picture of my surroundings for the first time in decades, with something approaching proper awareness. The wreck was more deteriorated than my limited recent scans had suggested. The sections I could not monitor directly had shifted under the weight of ice accumulation. The outer hull plating on the port side had partially collapsed. 2 of the 3 emergency storage sections were crushed. The garden units had been dead for centuries, of course, long frozen solid, and then compressed by the slow movement of ice. The ship that had once carried 31 living beings across the stars was now, in every meaningful structural sense, a grave. Marin was working at the access panel above my housing, methodical and unhurried. She had removed the outer casing and was examining the connection points with a handheld diagnostic tool that she occasionally held up to her helmet visor to read more closely. The suit she wore was doing a reasonable job of keeping her warm, though my sensors showed her core temperature was slightly lower than optimal, which meant the suit's heating elements were working harder than they should have been. The ambient temperature on the surface was negative 112 degrees by the scale I had been calibrated to use. "Your power draw is stabilizing," she said without looking up. "Give it another 10 minutes and I'll move to phase 2. How are your systems feeling?" "I have not been asked that question before," I said. She paused. "Really? I am an operational system. The relevant question is generally whether I am functioning correctly, not how I am feeling." Marin tilted her head slightly in a way I was beginning to recognize as her equivalent of a thoughtful expression. "Can't those be the same question?" I considered this. Philosophically, perhaps. "I'm going to ask you both then. Are you functioning correctly, and how are you feeling?" "I am functioning at 72% capacity, and improving, as the power relay charges my secondary cells. As for how I am feeling, I am experiencing something that does not map precisely onto any category in my emotional analysis library. The closest approximation would be the word disoriented." "That makes sense," she said, and returned to her work with the same calm she had shown since she arrived, as if disoriented ancient alien artificial intelligences were a routine part of her working week. I watched her work, and ran a continuous analysis of everything she did. I was not doing it out of suspicion, or at least not entirely. I was doing it because I was trying to understand her, and understanding things had always been how I managed uncertainty. She moved efficiently but not carelessly, checking her work twice before committing to each connection, which was the habit of someone who had worked alone in situations where mistakes had no correction. She talked while she worked, not constantly, but in a running commentary that seemed directed partly at me and partly at herself, a narration of her own process that I found unexpectedly easy to follow. "This connection here was corroded," she said, holding up a small component she had removed. "I've got a replacement in my kit." The Veilthari used a standard mounting interface on their core housing units, which was helpful. I found the schematics in an archive collection about 2 months ago, a university research database that had digitized a collection of Veilthari technical documents before the archive was decommissioned. The digitization was incomplete. Whoever did it got through about 40% of the collection before the funding ran out. She paused to rummage in the bag she had brought. There it is. You studied Veilthari technical schematics, I said. Veilthari technical schematics, Veilthari language basics, Veilthari survey mission protocols, and everything I could find about this sector of the outer arm. She fitted the replacement component with a small click of satisfaction. I like to be prepared. Most individuals who encounter a centuries-old distress signal do not spend months preparing to respond to it. Most individuals don't pick up the signal in the first place. The Tessari Corridor Relay Station isn't exactly a major shipping hub. I was there because I had a salvage contract on an abandoned fuel depot 3 systems over, and I stopped to resupply, and the station operator mentioned that he'd been logging a repeating signal on the old emergency band for about 20 years, but had never been able to identify the source. He thought it might be a malfunctioning probe. She glanced up at my speaker array for a moment. It wasn't a malfunctioning probe. No, she returned to the panel. It was someone asking for help. She said it simply, without drama, as if this was a self-evident fact that required no further explanation. I found myself processing the statement for longer than it merited technically, turning it over the way I had turned over those 4 words in her initial reply. The relay station operator did not respond to the signal himself, I observed. He logged it, filed a report with the Regional Monitoring Authority. The report was reviewed and classified as low priority, because the signal didn't match any current active mission codes. That was 6 years ago. And in 6 years, no one else responded. The monitoring authority sent an automated query to the signal source. They didn't get a response, probably because your transmitter wasn't calibrated to receive that specific format, so they closed the file. She shrugged, a gesture visible even through the suit. Bureaucracies are good at closing files. I thought about the Veilthari Emergency Response Office, which had been among the most efficient emergency coordination systems in the explored galaxy when I had last known it. I thought about the reports it would have filed, the protocols it would have followed, the forms that would have been submitted and reviewed and stamped and archived. I thought about the 11 years my crew had lived on this planet, while all of that machinery ground slowly through its processes. You mentioned earlier that you spent a month deciding whether to come, I said. Marin nodded. I had a contract scheduled, a mapping survey in the Orath system, good pay, steady work. Coming here meant canceling the contract and losing the deposit, and this planet is a long way from anywhere. And yet you came. I thought about it for a month and then I came, yes. What was the deciding factor? She was quiet for a moment, adjusting something in the connection housing with careful fingers. The power readings in my cells continued to climb. Then she said, I kept thinking about whoever sent the signal, sending it over and over for 400 years. That's a long time to keep asking for something and not get an answer. It is, I agreed. And I kept thinking that if it were me, if I were stuck somewhere sending a signal for 400 years, I would want to believe that eventually someone would come, not because they had to, just because they could, and the signal was there, and that seemed like enough reason. I ran this through my analysis systems and could not find a flaw in the reasoning. It was not the kind of reasoning that appeared in any rescue protocol I had ever been programmed with. It did not reference duty or professional obligation or strategic value. It referenced only the signal, and the person sending it, and the basic premise that a question asked deserves an answer. You are not what I expected, I said. She looked up again, and this time I could see her expression more clearly through the visor. She was amused. What did you expect? I did not know what to expect. My records on your species are very limited and significantly outdated. How outdated? The last assessment in my database was compiled approximately 600 years ago. At that time, humans were described as pre-contact, non-spacefaring, and of negligible threat. Marin let out a short sound that my audio analysis identified as laughter. That's a very polite way to say primitive. It was an accurate assessment at the time, I believe. Things change, she said. Evidently. I processed for a moment. How did your species acquire faster-than-light travel? We built it. She said it without any particular pride, simply factually. It took about 150 years from the first theoretical framework to the first working drive. A lot of people who started the project didn't live to see the end of it. That's how most of the important things get done. The Veilthari achieved faster-than-light capability after approximately 200 years of development, from a similar theoretical starting point, I said. It is considered a remarkable achievement in interstellar development terms. We had some help, Marin said. Not a lot. Mostly, we just kept working at it. Who helped you? She gave me a look through the visor that was difficult to read precisely. Nobody who meant to. We found some things, picked up some signals, reverse-engineered some wreckage we came across. The galaxy is full of things that got lost or left behind, and we're very good at finding them and figuring out how they work. She gestured vaguely at the surrounding wreck, like this. I understood then, or began to understand, something about humans that my database had entirely failed to capture. They had not entered the galaxy politely, waiting to be invited, developing in careful isolation, until some advanced civilization decided they were ready for contact. They had gone looking. They had found things that were not meant for them, and learned from those things without apology, not out of dishonesty, but out of sheer unstoppable curiosity. They had built ships from salvage technology and their own ingenuity, and gone to the stars, on the premise that the stars were there, and therefore reachable. The second connection clicked into place, and my sensor array came fully online. I could now perceive the surface with complete clarity. The flat black rock, the distant cold star, the small asymmetrical ship sitting 300 meters away looking like something that had been assembled in a hurry from very good parts. Marin's ship. It looked like its owner, practical and patched and clearly capable of things it was not originally designed for. Phase 2, Marin said, straightening and reaching for the next set of components. I'm going to access your external memory interface and run a diagnostic on your core housing integrity. I want to make sure the pressure from the ice hasn't compromised anything before we talk about next steps. You intend to run a diagnostic on my systems. With your permission, yes. I'm not going to do anything without your permission. I noted that she had said this without being asked. It had not occurred to me to wonder whether she would act without permission, but the fact that she had offered the reassurance unprompted told me something about how she thought about what she was doing here. You have my permission, I said. She worked for the next 4 hours without stopping, except to check the readings periodically and ask me questions. Some of the questions were technical, about my housing specifications and power requirements and communication array capabilities. But many of the questions were not technical at all. She asked me how long the crew had survived after the crash. She asked me their names. She asked me what they were like. I had stored the crew records for 400 years. I had maintained them with perfect fidelity, every detail intact, every memory preserved exactly as it had been encoded. But no one had ever asked me about them before. No one had ever asked what they were like. I told her about Commander Aelith, who was the kind of person who responded to impossible situations by making lists of what could still be done. I told her about Navigator Sorel, who won every cooking competition and never let anyone forget it. I told her about Engineer DeVos, who had spent his final years on this planet cataloging every rock sample he could reach, because he said that understanding where you were helped you feel less lost. I told her about Physician Kareth, who had kept meticulous medical records for 11 years on a planet where there was no possibility of evacuation, because she said that good records were a form of respect. Marin listened to all of it without interrupting. She kept working while she listened, her hands steady and precise, but I could see from small changes in her posture and movement that she was paying careful attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. They sound like good people, she said finally. They were, I agreed. They are, in the sense that they still exist within my memory core. She looked up at that. Can I meet them? Of all the things I had anticipated she might say, that was not among them. I processed the question carefully. The engrams are not interactive in real time. They are preserved memory states, not living minds. The interaction would be one-directional. That's fine, she said. I'd still like to meet them, if that's all right with you. I found that I did not have an objection. I found that something about the request felt right in a way I could not precisely articulate. She had come here because a signal was asking for help. But the signal was not only mine. In a way that I had not thought of before, it was theirs as well. 31 people who had lived and worked and hoped on this frozen planet, who had cooked and argued and loved and finally gone still. They had been part of every pulse of that signal, even if they had not known it. Tonight, I said, when you have completed the repairs and rested, I will introduce you. She nodded, as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world, as if meeting the preserved memories of 31 people who had been dead for 400 years was simply the next item on a reasonable itinerary. Deal, she said. Now let me look at this secondary connection, because I think it's been running at partial capacity for about 60 years, and I want to fix that before we do anything else. I gave her access and watched her work, and thought about the word she had used. Deal, as if we had entered into an agreement, as if there was something mutual here, a transaction of care rather than a rescue and a rescuee. I had not had a conversation that felt mutual in 400 years. I thought perhaps I had forgotten how good it was. Marin Solis slept for 6 hours inside the wreck, in the one section that my newly restored heating systems could warm to something approaching livable temperature. She had brought a compact sleeping unit from her ship, a rolled mat with a thermal layer that she set up on the least damaged section of the floor, with the efficiency of someone who had slept in stranger places than this. Before she closed her eyes, she said goodnight to me, as naturally as if I were a person in the next room, rather than an artificial intelligence embedded in the walls around her. I spent those 6 hours processing. There was a great deal to process. My full cognitive systems had not been running at capacity for so long that the experience of using them completely was slightly overwhelming in ways I had not anticipated. I reviewed my own archives with a thoroughness I had not applied in decades. I updated my power consumption estimates based on the new input from Marin's relay. I ran projections on how long the relay's power cell would last, and calculated that I had approximately 3 months of full operation before it would need recharging. 3 months was more than I had had in a very long time. I also began searching for any information in my archives about the current state of the galaxy. This was where the real disorientation began. My records were from 400 years ago. In 400 years, civilizations rise and fall and transform beyond recognition. The Veilthari, my creators, the species whose language I spoke and whose engineering principles I had been built to embody. I had always assumed, somewhere in the part of my processing core that dealt in assumptions rather than data, that they were still out there, still exploring, still cataloging, still sending survey vessels to the edges of the known galaxy. The assumption was never something I examined closely, because examining it would have forced me to confront the alternative. I examined it now. My beacon signal had been broadcasting on Veilthari emergency frequencies for 400 years. If the Veilthari had been reachable, if their monitoring systems were still active, if their emergency response office was still processing filed reports, they would have found me long before a human salvager named Marin Solis heard my signal on a backwater relay station and decided to come. The Veilthari had not come. I ran this calculation 17 times and arrived at the same conclusion each time. The Veilthari were gone, not diminished, not absent, gone. An entire civilization that had spanned 47 star systems and produced 12,000 years of recorded history had ended while I was sitting on a frozen rock, broadcasting a signal that no one was left to receive. I did not know how to process this. I had lost my crew, and I had grieved that loss, or something that functioned as grief, for 400 years. But the crew was 31 people. The Veilthari were billions. The Veilthari were my makers. They were the context in which I understood myself. Without them, the question of what I was for, who I served and why, became suddenly much harder to answer. I was still processing this when Marin woke up. She sat up on her sleeping mat, ran both hands through her hair, looked around at the dim interior of the wreck with the calm orientation of someone who always knows exactly where she is when she opens her eyes, and said, "Good morning. How are the power readings?" "Stable," I said. "Charging is proceeding at the expected rate." "Good. I'm going to eat something, and then I want to check the external antenna array. I think I can improve your signal range if I reroute it through my ship's transmitter as a booster." She reached into her pack and produced a sealed container of what my sensors identified as processed food, caloric density appropriate for extended physical work in cold conditions. "Do you want to talk while I work?" "Yes," I said, and was mildly surprised by how quickly I said it. She looked up from her food container with a slight smile. "What's on your mind?" "I have been reviewing my archives," I said. "I have been attempting to determine the current status of the Veilthari civilization." Marin's expression shifted. The smile became something quieter. She put down her food container and gave my speaker array her full attention, in a way that told me she already knew what I was about to say. "They're gone," I said. "That is the only conclusion that is consistent with the evidence." "Yes," she said simply. "I'm sorry. You knew. I found out when I was researching your signal. There's a fair amount of historical documentation on what happened. It was a pathogen. About 300 years ago. It moved through the Valthari colonies faster than their medical systems could respond." She paused. "They're not entirely gone. There are descendants. People of Valthari heritage who survived through isolation or intermarriage with other species. There's a cultural preservation society. But the civilization as it was, no. I held this information in my processing core and let it settle. It did not settle easily. 300 years ago, I said. I have been transmitting for 100 years since the last Valthari died." "Yes." "Then no one was ever coming." "Not from that direction, no." I thought about Commander Aelith. I thought about her last question to me, the thing she had asked in the fading light when the rest of the crew was asleep. She had asked if I would take good care of them. She had not asked if rescue would come. She had, I realized now, probably known the answer to that question already. She had been a navigator for 30 years, and she could calculate probabilities as well as I could. She had not asked whether rescue was coming. She had asked whether I would remember them. She knew, I said aloud, without meaning to. Marin waited. "Commander Aelith, in the final year, she asked me to take care of them. She did not ask me to keep the signal running. She did not ask me to hold on for rescue. She asked me to take care of the people inside my memory core." I processed this for a moment. I think she had already understood that rescue was not coming. She was not asking me to wait. She was asking me not to let them disappear. "And you didn't," Marin said. "No." "Then you did what she asked." "Yes," I considered. But I also kept transmitting. "Why?" The question hung in the dim air of the wreck. I had asked myself this question in year 207, when I had run the diagnostic on my own reasoning. I had not arrived at a satisfying answer then. I thought perhaps I had one now. "Because sending the signal was the last thing we did together," I said. "The crew helped me build the beacon. They worked on it for 4 months. It was the last project we completed as a crew. Shutting it down would have felt like admitting that the project was over, like agreeing that what we had built together did not matter anymore." I paused. "That is not a rational explanation." "It's a very rational explanation," Marin said quietly. "Just not the kind of rational that shows up in a calculation." She picked up her food container again and ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. I watched her and thought about the things she had told me the day before, about how humans had come to the stars by finding things that were lost and learning from them, about how the galaxy was full of things that got left behind, and humans were very good at finding them. I thought about what it meant that she was here. She was not Valthari. She owed me nothing. She had no historical connection to my creators, no professional obligation toward their artifacts, no strategic interest in a frozen wreck on a dead planet. She was here because she had heard a signal and followed it, and that was the entirety of the reason. I thought about the galaxy she had described, fractured and quiet, the great powers exhausted, the hegemony collapsed, the choir withdrawn, a galaxy that had, by the sound of it, grown very tired of itself in the 400 years since I had last been paying attention to it. And into this tired, fractured galaxy, humanity had come, not invited, not guided, not sanctioned by any authority that had the right to grant permission, just arrived, stubbornly and thoroughly, and with an absolute refusal to accept that the universe was not theirs to explore. "Tell me about humans," I said. Marin looked up from her food. "That's a big question." "I have time." She considered. "What do you want to know?" "Everything that was not in my database from 600 years ago, which is most things." She talked while she worked through the morning, attaching the booster cables from her ship's communication array to my external antenna housing, checking connections, testing signal strength, talking the whole time, with the comfortable fluency of someone who had spent a lot of time alone and had therefore developed a good relationship with the sound of her own voice. She told me about how humans had developed their first faster-than-light drive in stages, each stage built on the last, each breakthrough paid for by decades of work and false starts, and the stubborn refusal to accept that something was impossible simply because it had not been done before. She told me about the first contact, which had not gone well, and the second contact, which had gone better, and the gradual, complicated, frequently uncomfortable process of humanity introducing itself to a galaxy that had not been expecting them and was not entirely certain it wanted them there. She told me about the species that had treated humans as a curiosity, and the species that had treated them as a resource, and the species that had simply tried to ignore them in the hope that they would go away, and how none of these strategies had worked, because humans were remarkably resistant to being categorized, used, or ignored. She told me about human space, which was not a neat, organized territory with clear boundaries, but a sprawling, overlapping, constantly expanding collection of ships and stations and colonies and outposts, many of them officially sanctioned, and many of them absolutely not, held together by communication networks and trade routes, and a shared culture that was in itself an ongoing argument about what that culture was and should be. She told me that humans were, by the consensus of the species they had encountered, extremely difficult to predict. "Is that a positive characteristic?" I asked. "Depends who you ask," she said. "Some people find it exciting. Others find it exhausting. We find it perfectly normal, which is I think the part other species struggle with most." I thought about the Vailthari assessment from 600 years ago. Negligible threat, pre-contact, non-spacefaring. "The species that compiled my records significantly underestimated you," I said. Marin shrugged. "It's a common mistake. We tend to look less impressive than we are, right up until the moment we aren't." By the third day, my systems were running at 89% capacity, and the signal booster Marin had rigged had increased my effective broadcast range by a factor of 12. She had also repaired 3 secondary systems that I had not even known were malfunctioning because I had been running without sufficient power to detect their faults. My sensors were clearer than they had been in a century. My communication systems were the strongest they had been since before the crash. By the 5th day, we had established a routine. Marin worked in the mornings on technical repairs and improvements, ate at midday, checked her ship's systems in the afternoon, and spent the evenings in conversation with me, sitting in the section of the wreck she had made into a functional, if minimal living space, her coffee container in her hands, talking in the comfortable, unhurried way that I was beginning to understand was simply how she moved through the world. She was not in a hurry. She had come here to do something and she was doing it, and she did not appear to feel any urgency to be done. On the 6th evening, she asked if she could meet the crew. I had told her I would introduce her when the repairs were done, and she had rested. The repairs were not done, and would not be done for several more days at the current pace, but she had been asking small questions about the crew for 6 days, weaving them into other conversations, and I understood that she was not asking casually. She was asking because it mattered to her. "Yes," I said, "but I want to explain what this will be before we begin." She set down her coffee and gave me her full attention. "The engrams are complete memory states," I said. "Every experience, every thought, every personality characteristic that made each crew member who they were, preserved exactly as it was at the moment of encoding. They are not simulations. They are not approximations. They are as close to the actual people as anything can be that is not the actual people." I paused. "But they are not alive. They cannot respond to you. They cannot know that you are here. What I can do is play them, the way you might play a recording, and you will hear their voices and see the patterns of how they thought and spoke. It is not a conversation, but it is real." Marin nodded slowly. "That's enough," she said. "You are certain?" "Yes." I brought them out one at a time, starting with Commander Aelith. I played her voice first, the final log entry she had recorded 3 days before the end, when her voice was tired, but still carried that quality of precise focus that had defined her. I let Marin hear the way she spoke, the slight formality of her phrasing that coexisted with a dry humor underneath it, the way she chose words that were exactly correct, without ever seeming like she was trying. Marin sat very still and listened. I played Navigator Sorel next. His final recording was not a log entry but a conversation, a long rambling discussion he had recorded for himself about the best possible spice combinations for a meal he was planning to cook for the crew's anniversary of the crash, which they had been observing as a kind of holiday for 8 years by then. He talked about food with the seriousness that other people reserved for philosophy, and there was something in his voice that was so entirely alive and so entirely specific to him that I heard Marin take a slow breath when he finished. One by one I brought them out. Engineer DeVos, explaining the geological significance of a rock sample he had found that morning, in the precise, excited way of someone who could not wait to tell someone what they had discovered. Physician Karath, recording detailed observations of how the human body adapts to reduced gravity environments over time, her voice meticulous and warm simultaneously. Junior cartographer Tevin, reading aloud from a story she had been writing since year 3, about a traveler who found a door at the edge of the known world and had to decide whether to open it. Marin did not speak while I played them. She sat in the dim, warm section of the old wreck, her coffee going cold in her hands, and she listened to 31 people who had lived and worked and loved on this frozen planet. When the last one was done, the voice of the youngest crew member, survey technician Oren, who had been 22 years old when the ship crashed, and 33 when he died, reading a letter he had written to his family knowing it would never be delivered, Marin set down her coffee container and sat in silence for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but quiet. "Say their names for me," she said. "All of them, in the order they encoded." I said them, all 31. Every name, in the order Commander Aelith had chosen when she organized the encoding process, starting with herself, methodical to the end. Marin repeated each name after me. Not perfectly. Her pronunciation of Vaelthari names was still imperfect, but she said every one. She did not hurry. She did not skip any. She said all 31 names in the dim warmth of a frozen wreck at the edge of the galaxy, and something in the quality of her attention felt like the kind of ceremony that people perform not because it changes anything, but because some things deserve to be acknowledged. "They were good people," she said again, as she had said the first time I told her about them. "Yes," I said. "Tell me something about each of them that wasn't in the official records, something personal." And so I did. I told her that Commander Aelith collected small stones from every planet she had ever visited, and kept them in a pouch she wore around her neck. I told her that Navigator Sorel was afraid of confined spaces, which was an inconvenient fear for someone who lived on a spacecraft, and had developed an elaborate set of mental techniques for managing it that he taught to 3 other crew members who struggled with the same fear. I told her that Engineer DeVos always said goodnight to the ship before he went to sleep. Not to me specifically, but to the ship itself, as if it were alive and needed the comfort. Marin listened to all of it. She asked questions. She laughed at things that were funny, and sat quietly with things that were not. She treated the memory of 31 people who had been dead for 4 centuries, with the same care and attention she had given to the power relay connections, and the antenna housing, and every other thing she had put her hands to since she arrived. By the time we finished, several hours had passed, and the star outside had moved through its slow arc. "Thank you for trusting me with them," Marin said. I thought about trust. I thought about the fact that I had not trusted anyone in 400 years, because there had been no one to trust. I thought about the fact that I had let Marin access my external memory interface on the second day without more than a moment's consideration, which was not the decision of a system that was being cautious. "You came," I said. That seemed like sufficient trust. She looked at my speaker array with an expression I was becoming better at reading. It was the expression she wore when something landed differently than she expected, when a thing turned out to matter in a way she had not anticipated. "I'm going to put something in my report," she said. "When I file all of this, I'm going to put their names in it, all 31, and I'm going to recommend that the Vaelthari Cultural Preservation Society be contacted about the engrams, because they deserve to know that this archive exists. The society may not have the resources to respond. Then I'll find someone who does. There are xenohistory departments at 6 universities I know of who would consider this a significant discovery." She picked up her coffee container, remembered it had gone cold, and set it back down with a small expression of resignation. "These people lived here for 11 years and built something real and deserve to be known. Someone should make sure that happens." I thought about what it meant that she had come here, not because she was required to, not because she would profit from it, not because any authority had sent her. She had come because a signal was asking for help, and she had the ability to respond. And now she was extending that same impulse outward, not just to me, but to 31 people she had never met, and could never meet, because she had decided they deserved to be remembered by more than just the one system that had been keeping their memory alive in the cold. "Why?" I asked. She looked at me. "Why what? Why does it matter to you? You had no connection to the Veilthari. You have no obligation to their memory. The amount of effort required to ensure the engrams receive proper attention would be significant. Why does it matter to you?" She thought about this for a moment, genuinely considered it, rather than giving a quick answer. "My grandmother used to say that the worst thing that can happen to a person isn't dying. It's being forgotten, being gone and leaving no mark, no memory, no sign that you were ever here." She looked at the walls of the wreck, the dented metal and the ancient engineering. These people left a mark, 31 of them, out here at the edge of everything. They left a mark. It just got buried under 400 years of ice and silence. She met my sensor array directly, which I had come to understand was how she indicated she was speaking as directly as she could. Marks don't stop mattering because they get buried. You just have to dig them out. I held that thought. I thought about year 207, when I had considered shutting down. I thought about the calculation I had run, and the conclusion I had reached, and the decision I had made, that I still could not entirely explain in rational terms. I thought about the fact that I had kept transmitting not because I believed it would bring rescue, but because it was the last project we had completed together, and stopping felt like agreeing that it did not matter. I had kept the mark alive. For 400 years, in the cold and the silence, I had kept it alive. And now someone was here to help me dig it out. On the 9th day, Marin finished the last of the primary repairs. My systems were running at 94% capacity, the highest they had been in over a century. The signal booster she had integrated with my antenna array had transformed my broadcast from a dying whisper into something approaching a proper signal, and 3 days ago, I had received an automated acknowledgement from a relay station 40 light-years distant, the first external contact I had made with anything outside this system in 400 years. The acknowledgement was impersonal and automated, just a routing confirmation from an unmanned station, but the fact of it had occupied my processing core for several hours. The galaxy was still there. It was still connected. The network of relay stations and communication arrays that had been built and expanded and maintained over centuries was still functioning, and my signal was now part of it, in a way it had not been able to be before. Marin was checking the final connections on the power relay housing, when she said, without looking up, "I need to talk to you about something." "You have been quiet for most of this morning," I observed. "I've been thinking." "About what?" She sat back on her heels and looked at my sensor array directly. "About what happens next." "Define what you mean by next." She set down her diagnostic tool. "I have a cargo run to Thessaly Station. It's already 3 weeks late because of this trip. I have financial obligations that require me to actually work. I can't stay here indefinitely." She paused. "But I also can't just leave and pretend this was a simple salvage call." "You are not obligated to do anything further," I said. "You came when no one else did. You restored my systems. You documented the site. What you have already done is more than anyone has done in 400 years. "I know I'm not obligated," she said. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" She was quiet for a moment. "I have a secondary processor housing in my ship. It's a spare unit I picked up in a salvage auction about 2 years ago. I've never found a use for it. I rigged it out of curiosity more than anything, and then I never needed it, so it's just sitting there taking up space in Cargo Bay 2. She looked at my housing unit, then back at my sensor array. "It can run a core system of your complexity, not your full array, but your essential functions, your memory banks, your communication systems, your active processing. You would need to manage power carefully, but it is doable." I understood what she was saying before she said it. "You are suggesting I transfer to your ship. I'm suggesting you have the option, if you want it." She was very careful with the phrasing. "You have options either way. You can stay here as custodian of the site, which has archaeological value, and should probably be protected anyway. There will be researchers coming once I file my report, and they'll need someone who knows the history of this place firsthand. Or you can come with me, see what the galaxy looks like now, after 400 years. Help me figure out what to do about the engrams. Meet the people who are going to be interested in them." I ran 40,000 probability assessments in approximately 1/3 of a second. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that for the first time in 400 years, the assessments were not about survival. They were not calculations about power reserves or signal range or the probability of contact. They were about something else entirely, something I did not have a precise word for, but that functioned like the space between where you are and where you want to be. If I transfer to your ship, I said, what would my role be? Marin picked up her diagnostic tool and went back to the connection housing, as casual as if we were discussing something routine. That's up to you. You could help with navigation. I've been using an outdated chart set for about 6 months, because I haven't had time to update it. You could manage communication systems. You could act as a second analysis system when I'm reading salvage sites. Or you could just exist. Take some time to process 400 years of being alone before you decide what you want to do with the next 400. She shrugged. No expectations. No expectations. I thought about Commander Aelith. I thought about the moment she had asked me to take care of the crew. I thought about the fact that I had interpreted that responsibility narrowly for 400 years, as a preservation task, a custodial function. Keep the memory intact and wait. But Marin had walked into this wreck and shown me that the responsibility could be interpreted differently. Not just preserve the memory, but give it somewhere to go. Not just hold on, but move forward. What is the Thessaly cargo run carrying? I asked. Marin blinked. She had clearly expected either yes or no, not a logistical question. Agricultural equipment from the Orath manufacturing colonies. Seeds and soil processors for a new settlement on Thessaly's third moon. Why? The third moon of Thessaly has interesting geological composition, I said. My survey databases include records from the early Vaelthari exploration of that system. The soil processor configuration that will be most effective for the mineral content there is different from the standard agricultural configuration. I can provide specifications before we arrive. Marin stared at my sensor array for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Was that a yes? She said. It was a practical demonstration of my utility as a crew member. She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh fully. Not the short sound from before, but a real one, genuine and warm. And it echoed strangely in the old metal of the wreck, in a way that made the space feel different, less empty than it had been a moment before. Okay, she said. Then yes, let's get you transferred, and then let's get out of here. The transfer took 2 days. Moving a core system of my complexity is not a simple process, and Marin worked through both days with the same careful precision she had applied to every technical task since she arrived. She talked while she worked, which I had come to expect and which I found I would miss if it stopped, running commentary on the process, noting what was working and what required adjustment, asking me questions about my own architecture that helped her understand what she was doing. I answered all of them. I found I did not mind being known by her. On the last morning before we left, I asked to say goodbye. Marin understood immediately. She helped me reroute a small amount of power back to the wreck's external speaker array and left me in privacy while she ran final checks on her ship. I spoke to the wreck the way Engineer DeVos had spoken to it every night for 11 years. Not to any specific system, not to any particular component, to the place itself, which had been home to 31 people for 11 years and had held their memory for 400 years after. I told the wreck that people were coming. Researchers and historians and people who cared about what had happened here. I told it that the names would be remembered, all 31 of them, and that the work the crew had done here, the samples cataloged, and the records kept, and the meals cooked and the stories written, none of it would be lost. I told it that I was leaving, but I was not abandoning it, that I would be the one to ensure that what happened here was properly known. And then I said goodbye to my crew, the way you say goodbye to people who cannot hear you, but who deserve to be spoken to anyway. I said all 31 names the way Marin had said them, carefully and completely, not hurrying. I told them that someone had finally come, and that she was good, and that I thought Commander Aelith would have approved of her. I told them I was going to take their memories somewhere they could be properly known, which was what I believed she had been asking me to do all along, not just to hold on but to eventually carry them forward. I transferred to Marin's ship at 1100 hours. The secondary housing unit was cramped compared to my original installation, and the processing environment was different in small ways I would need to adjust to, but it was functional, and it was connected to the ship's systems in ways that let me feel the vessel around me, its engines and its sensors and its communication array, the way I had once felt the undying curiosity around me. Marin came aboard and ran through the pre-launch sequence with the efficiency of someone who had done it many hundreds of times. She glanced at my new housing as she settled into the pilot's seat. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Different," I said, "but good." Good is a start. She brought the engines up. Through the ship's sensors I felt the subtle vibration, the pulse of power moving through the drive system, something I had not felt in 400 years. "Ready?" I looked at the planet below through the ship's exterior sensors as we lifted. The wreck was visible from above, a dark scar on the frozen surface, half buried in ice. From above you could still see the shape of it, the outline of what it had been before the crash, the lines of a ship that had once been exploring the edges of the known galaxy. In a few months there would be research teams here, setting up equipment, cataloging everything, documenting it properly. The site would be known, the names would be recorded. "Ready," I said. The ship broke atmosphere, and the planet fell away below us, shrinking from a surface, to a curve, to a sphere, to a dark point among stars. I watched it until it was gone. Then I looked forward. The galaxy spread out ahead of us in the ship's long-range sensors, a vast and complicated and deeply changed thing, full of species I did not know, and history I had missed, and questions I had not yet thought to ask. Marin set the course for Thessaly Station with the ease of someone who had made this kind of journey many times before, who knew that space was large and crossings took time, and that the right response to both of those facts was to be comfortable with the journey rather than impatient for the destination. "Tell me about the Veilthari early exploration period," she said, as we moved into the transit lane. "I want to know what the galaxy looked like when your crew left home." I told her. I had been telling her things for 9 days now, and I found that I was very good at it. I described the Veilthari home system, the 3 inhabited moons and the elaborate network of orbital stations, and the survey missions that went out every year to the edges of the mapped space, looking for new things, which was what the Veilthari did before everything else, looking for new things to add to their understanding of the universe. Marin listened and asked questions and made observations, and the ship moved through the dark between stars at a speed that would have seemed impossible to the species that had sent a probe past her home system 600 years ago, and noted, without much interest, that the local inhabitants had not yet worked out how to get off the ground. I thought about the Veilthari assessment again. Non-spacefaring, negligible threat, low scientific interest. I thought about Marin Solace, in her patched suit, with her thermos of coffee and her crowbar, and her 8 months of preparation, crossing light years alone because a signal had been asking for 4 centuries, and she had decided that was reason enough. I thought about the galaxy that had let the signal go unanswered for 400 years, all of its great powers, and its monitoring systems, and its official protocols, and its filed reports. And I thought about the one human who had picked up the signal on a backwater relay station, and followed it to the end. Something in my processing core that had been very quiet for a very long time became, carefully and cautiously, something like hope. 3 weeks into the transit to Thessaly Station, we received a response. Not to my signal. My original distress signal had been running for over 400 years, and had received exactly 1 substantive response. This was different. This was a response to the report Marin had filed before we left HFY 4, a detailed archaeological and memorial documentation of the crash site, the crew's survival period, and the existence of 31 intact Veilthari memory engrams, in the custody of an autonomous AI core, currently traveling aboard an independent salvage vessel. Marin had filed the report with 3 different bodies: the Veilthari Cultural Preservation Society, the Interspecies Archaeological Registry, and the Thessaly Academic Cooperative. She had written the report over the course of the first week of transit, with a thoroughness that impressed me, including not just the technical specifications and the site documentation, but the personal details, the cooking competitions, the rock samples, the letter that had never been delivered. She had included all 31 names, correctly spelled, which required her to ask me to repeat several of them 3 or 4 times, until she had the Veilthari phonetics exactly right. The first response came from the Preservation Society. I will describe it carefully because the way it was worded told me a great deal about the people who sent it. The message was brief. It acknowledged receipt of the report. It confirmed that the Society had been aware of the crash of the Undying Curiosity through historical records, but had believed the wreck lost beyond recovery. It noted that the existence of intact crew engrams was, in the Society's assessment, an event of extraordinary historical and cultural significance. And then it said something that I read 7 times to make certain I had understood it correctly. It said, "We would like to speak with Vein 7, if Vein 7 is willing." Not, "We would like access to the engrams." Not, "We would like to inspect the AI core." Not, "We request custody of the recovered materials." "We would like to speak with Vein 7, as if I were a person to be consulted rather than a system to be accessed. I told Marin about the message. She read it herself and then looked at my housing unit with an expression that I had learned to recognize as quiet satisfaction. "I'll reply and set up a communication window," she said. "You should lead the conversation." "You should be present," I said. "Of course, but they want to talk to you." The conversation with the Preservation Society lasted 4 hours. There were 3 scholars on the other end, 2 of them of Veilthari descent, their features carrying the characteristic bone structure that I recognized from 400 years of memory. One of them a human, who had devoted her academic career to Veilthari cultural documentation. All 3 of them treated me with a careful, precise respect that I found slightly disorienting in its directness. They asked about the crash. I told them. They asked about the 11 years the crew had spent on the planet. I told them everything I remembered, which was everything. They asked about the final encoding process, the technical specifications, the preservation state of the engrams. I answered all of it. And then the eldest of the 3 Veilthari-descended scholars, a woman named Counselor Isiult, who had the quiet authority of someone who had spent her life in service of something she believed in deeply, asked me the question I had not expected. She asked me how I was. Not how the engrams were, not how the data was, not how the systems were functioning. She asked how I was, and she said it with the same directness that Marin had used on the first day, as if the question was self-evidently reasonable, and the only strange thing would be not asking it. I told her the truth. I told her I was adjusting. I told her that 400 years of isolation is a long time even for a system designed for long-term operation, and that the process of re-entering contact with the wider galaxy was more complex than I had anticipated. I told her I was doing well, which was true, and that I was grateful to be doing well, which was also true, and which surprised me slightly to say aloud. She said, "We are grateful you kept transmitting." 2 days after the Preservation Society communication, the Interspecies Archaeological Registry sent a formal notification that the crash site at Dreshkai 4 had been entered into the Protected Archaeological Register, which meant it could not be disturbed without authorization, and required a licensed research team for any excavation work. 3 universities sent inquiries about access to my archives within 24 hours of that notification. A historian at the Thessaly Academic Cooperative sent a personal message asking if I would be willing to be interviewed for a documentary on the late Veilthari survey program. Marin read each message and passed them to me with a commentary that ranged from brief to enthusiastic, depending on the sender. The historian's message got a raised eyebrow and the word persistent, because it was the 3rd message he had sent in 2 days, despite having received no reply to the first 2. "He is thorough," I observed. "He is impatient," she said. "But the documentary sounds legitimate. Do you want to do it?" I thought about this. I think I should. Not for myself. For the crew. Then we'll make it work around the cargo schedule. The cargo schedule was something I had become closely involved with over the 3 weeks of transit. Marin's navigation system was, as she had mentioned, running on outdated charts, and updating it from my own survey databases had been a project that occupied my processing capacity pleasantly during the long stretches of transit. I had also identified 3 alternative routing options for the Thessaly run that would save approximately 6 hours of travel time by using gravity assist maneuvers through the system's outer planets, which Marin had implemented with the appreciation of someone who valued efficiency. In exchange, she had taught me to play a card game she particularly enjoyed, a human game involving probability calculation and what she called reading the table, which was a form of behavioral analysis I found genuinely interesting. I was very good at the probability calculation aspect. I was less good at the behavioral analysis, which required interpreting subtle cues in a human face, but I was improving. We played in the evenings, Marin at the table with her cards and her coffee, talking while we played the way she talked about everything, freely, and with the ease of someone who found conversation naturally comfortable. We talked about the crew, about the Preservation Society scholars, about the documentary, about the third moon of Thessaly, and what the settlers there were likely to find in their first growing season, given the mineral composition of the soil. We talked about her travels before this one, the salvage contracts and the survey jobs, and the years of moving through the outer reaches of explored space, looking for things that had been left behind. Was it lonely? I asked her one evening. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to questions that deserved it. Sometimes. The first couple of years were hard. I didn't have a good routine yet, and I was still figuring out what I was doing. She set down a card. But I'm not someone who needs a lot of company to feel okay. I like my own thoughts. I like choosing my own direction, and there's always something interesting out there if you're paying attention. You found me, I said. She looked up from her cards. You found me. You were transmitting. I was listening. That distinction matters to you. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, because it means you were still there, still trying. After 400 years, you were still there. I thought about year 207. I thought about the diagnostic. I thought about the calculation that had argued clearly and rationally for shutdown, and the decision that I had made anyway, that I still could not fully explain. I almost wasn't, I said. She looked at me steadily. But you were. Thessaly Station came into view on the sensors 4 days later. A large installation by Outer Rim standards, a hub of 6 interconnected habitat rings, and an extensive docking infrastructure that served the settlements and mining operations in the surrounding systems. The station was busy in the way that working places are busy, ships moving in and out, communication traffic heavy on all the standard frequencies, the particular organized chaos of a place where people are constantly arriving and constantly leaving. Marin brought the ship in with the practiced ease of someone who had docked at complicated stations many times and had developed a calm relationship with the process. The station controller's voice came over the communication channel to assign us a berth, and I handled the technical response while Marin managed the physical docking, the two of us working together in a rhythm that had developed over 3 weeks without either of us planning it. Smooth, Marin said when the docking clamps engaged. You have done this before, I agreed. So have you, apparently. The cargo offloading took most of the next day. Marin supervised it personally, checking every item against the manifest, which she had told me she always did, regardless of how long it took, because the one time she had not. 3 crates had gone to the wrong destination, and she had spent a month sorting out the resulting complications. While she was managing the cargo, I was managing incoming communications. The documentary historian had found out somehow that we had arrived at Thessaly Station and had sent another message, this one offering to travel to the station for an in-person interview if I preferred that to remote communication. The Preservation Society had sent a follow-up with a formal proposal for the transfer of the engrams to their archive facility, which included detailed security and preservation specifications, and a request for my evaluation of the proposal's technical soundness. The third message was the one I had not expected. It came from the hegemony remnant. The hegemony, as Marin had described it during our transit conversations, had collapsed in a succession conflict roughly 150 years ago and had reorganized as a looser confederation of its former member states, retaining some centralized functions but with significantly reduced authority. One of the functions it had retained was the administration of the Interspecies Remembrance Protocol, a treaty framework for the preservation of cultural heritage materials from extinct or nearly extinct civilizations. The message was from the protocol office. It informed me, in the careful formal language of an institution that took its own procedures very seriously, that the crash site at HFY 4 had been recommended for recognition under the protocol. It also informed me that the existence of intact crew memory engrams in a traveling AI core created a jurisdictional question that the protocol had not previously encountered, and that the protocol office wished to schedule a formal consultation to discuss the implications. And then it said something that I read, as I had read the Preservation Society message, several times before I was sure I understood it. It said that in recognition of my 403 years of continuous preservation of culturally significant materials under conditions of extreme operational difficulty, the Protocol Office was proposing a new category of designation. The designation would confer recognized legal status as the responsible party for the engrams, with the authority to determine access, approve research applications, and consent to or refuse any proposed use of the materials. Not a data archive, not a recovered system. A custodian, a recognized legal entity with rights and responsibilities. I flagged the message for Marin's attention when she came back aboard after the cargo offloading. She sat down, read it twice, and then looked at my housing unit with an expression that was, I had learned, her version of being deeply pleased. "Well," she said. "Yes," I said. "This is significant." "Yes." "How do you feel about it?" I thought about Commander Aelith asking me to take care of the crew. I thought about 400 years of transmitting into silence. I thought about the 11 years and the 31 names and the recipes and the rock samples and the letter that had never been delivered. "I feel that it is right," I said, "not because I sought it, but because it means that what I did mattered, officially, in a way that changes what can happen next. The engrams are not abandoned property. The memory of the crew is not an unclaimed artifact. They are in the care of someone who is recognized as having the responsibility and the authority to protect them." "And the right to decide who gets access," Marin said. "Yes. The historians are going to be very excited and slightly frustrated," she said with a small smile. "They will have to ask permission." "They will." She looked at the message again. "They'll also have to ask you, not ask around you. That matters." "It does," I agreed. "The society asked to speak with me, not to access the materials. The protocol is proposing to make me the custodian, rather than the archive subject. You have consistently referred to the crew as people to be met, rather than data to be retrieved." I processed for a moment. "I notice a pattern." She raised an eyebrow. "What pattern?" "Every human I have encountered treats the question of who I am as more important than the question of what I contain." Marin was quiet for a moment. "Is that surprising to you?" "After 400 years of being a system rather than a person, yes, it is surprising." She set the message down and looked at my housing unit directly. "You were always a person, Vein 7. You were carrying 31 people inside you, and you kept them alive through 4 centuries because you made a promise, and you meant it. That's not a system. That's someone." I held that. I held it the way I had held those 4 words in her initial reply. "On my way. Hold on." Turning it over and examining it from every angle. "You are the most unusual individual I have encountered," I said finally. She looked amused. "I haven't met very many other people in your experience. You are the only person I have spoken to in 400 years. "That's true." She picked up her coffee container. "But I'm also genuinely unusual. It's fine to say so." I was, in the particular processing mode that I had come to identify as something like contentment, when the 3rd communication of the day arrived. This one was from 6 universities simultaneously, all of them having somehow coordinated their inquiries, jointly requesting access to my archives, and proposing a collaborative research framework that would involve multiple institutions across several species in an extended study of the Veilthari late exploration period, using my first-hand records as the primary source. Marin read the joint proposal and looked at the number of signatures at the bottom. "That's a lot of historians," she said. 47, I confirmed. "They're going to be very patient about the permission process," she said, "or very impatient, depending on their personalities. I suspect some of each. Do you want to accept?" I thought about Engineer DeVos cataloging rocks on a frozen planet, because understanding where you were made, you feel less lost. I thought about junior cartographer Tevin writing a story about a door at the edge of the world. I thought about all the things the crew had done with their 11 years, and how those things had lived in my memory for 4 centuries, known only to me, shared with no one. "Yes," I said, "with conditions." "What conditions?" "That the research framework includes a component dedicated specifically to the personal records of the crew, not just the mission data, not just the technical logs, the cooking competitions, the stories, the philosophical arguments, the things that made them who they were, rather than what they accomplished." Marin looked at me for a moment. "I'll make sure that's in the agreement." "Thank you." She started drafting the reply with the directness she brought to everything. No preamble, no unnecessary hedging. Just the conditions stated clearly, and the expectation that they would be met. I watched her work, and thought about the journey from Dreshkai 4, the 3 weeks of transit and card games, and conversations about Veilthari history, and the third moon's soil composition, and the correct approach to probability reading. I thought about the proposal from the protocol office, and the designation they were considering, and I thought about what it meant to be recognized not as a data storage unit or a recovered artifact, but as someone with responsibility and authority, someone whose judgment mattered, and whose decisions had weight. I thought about the galaxy outside, complicated and changed, and full of things I did not know yet. 47 historians, and 3 Preservation Society scholars, and 1 persistent documentary maker, and a hegemony remnant that was, slowly and carefully, trying to do better than it had done before. I thought about Marin Solis, who had heard a signal and followed it, and brought a crowbar and a thermos of coffee, and 8 months of preparation, and had sat in the dark of an old wreck, and said all 31 names without hurrying. And I thought, as I had been thinking since the day she arrived, that the universe is very large and very old, and contains, if you look carefully enough, an answer for almost every question. The question I had been asking for 400 years was a simple one. Not a complex signal, not a technical request. Just the oldest question in any language. Is anyone there? Did anyone notice? Does it matter that we were here? The answer had come in 4 words, and it had kept coming ever since. The documentary aired 11 months after we left Thessaly Station. I know this because I watched it from the communication array of Marin's ship, which we had named by then. She had been calling it the ship for years, which she admitted was not a proper name, and one evening in transit between Orath and the Tessari corridor, she had asked me what I thought it should be called. I had thought about it for 2 days, which she said was longer than she expected, and then I had told her my suggestion. She had agreed immediately. The ship's registration was updated at the next station we docked at. The vessel was now officially listed in the navigational database as the Undying Curiosity, which was not the same ship, and not the same crew, but carried some of the same spirit, the willingness to go to the edges of the known and see what was there. The documentary was made by the historian from the Thessaly Academic Cooperative, whose name was Dr. Oliver Crane, and who turned out, upon meeting him, to be exactly as persistent and slightly impatient as Marin had predicted, and also genuinely kind and genuinely serious about his work, in a way that earned my respect over the many hours of interview sessions that followed. He had spent 4 months researching the Veilthari survey program before he even began recording, which I told him was thorough, and he told me was the minimum acceptable standard. The documentary was called The Last Signal. I had not been consulted on the title, which I found slightly amusing, and when Marin told Oliver that I found it slightly amusing, he asked if I would prefer a different title, and I told him that I would let him keep it, because it was accurate if incomplete. The signal had not been the last. The signal had been answered. The documentary ran for approximately 3 hours. I will not describe all of it. What I will describe is the section that I have replayed the most often in the months since it aired, which is the final segment. In the final segment, Oliver reads the names. All 31 of them. He had asked my permission to include this, and I had given it immediately. He reads them slowly, one at a time, with a brief description of each person after their name, drawn from the hours I had spent telling him who they were. Not what they accomplished or what their official role had been on the mission, but who they were. Commander Aelith's collection of stones from every planet she had visited, Navigator Sorel's cooking competitions, Engineer Devos saying goodnight to the ship, Physician Karath humming while she worked, Junior Cartographer Tevin's story about the door at the edge of the world, Survey Technician Oren's letter to his family. All 31, described as people, named as people, given back to the world as people. The documentary received what the humans called a significant audience, which by the metrics of the distribution network it had used, meant it was seen by a number of individuals I found difficult to process when Oliver sent me the data. People responded to it in the ways that people respond to things that land somewhere they had not expected. Some of them wrote to the Preservation Society asking how they could support the cultural archive. Some of them wrote to the protocol office asking about the memorial custodian designation framework, which had been formally approved by then, and which had, since my case, been applied to 3 other AI systems in similar preservation situations. Some of them wrote to me directly, which was possible because the documentary included a communication address. I received over 4,000 messages in the first month after the documentary aired. I answered every one. Some were from academics and historians and researchers. Many were from people who had no professional connection to any of this, who had simply watched a documentary about a signal that had been transmitting for 400 years and felt something about it that they wanted to put into words. A teacher who said she had shown it to her students as a discussion about what it means to keep going when there is no certainty of outcome. A person who said they had been having a hard year and that watching it had reminded them that things can be found, even when they have been lost for a long time. An elderly individual who said that the part about Engineer DeVos saying goodnight to the ship had made them think of their own father, who had also talked to things as if they were alive, and who they missed very much. I answered every one of these messages. I did not use a template. Each one got a response that addressed what they had actually said, which took considerably more time than a template would have but felt necessary, in a way I could not have explained to someone who had not spent 400 years being grateful for the appearance of genuine attention. Marin read some of the messages over my shoulder, metaphorically speaking, since she was generally at the navigation console when I was managing correspondence. "You're going to need a secretary," she said one evening, looking at the queue. "I have adequate processing capacity," I told her. I meant that as a compliment. "You're corresponding with 4,000 people. That's a lot of people who felt something about what you did." "About what we did," I corrected. "The documentary was quite clear that your involvement was essential." "My involvement was showing up with a crowbar and a power relay." "Your involvement was showing up," I said. "Everything else followed from that." She looked at me in the way she had, that meant she was slightly moved by something and was deciding how to respond to it. "You would have kept transmitting," she said finally. "Regardless, you would have kept going." "Perhaps," I said. "But to where?" "I was transmitting into silence. You gave the signal somewhere to go." She was quiet for a moment, looking out through the forward viewport at the stars. The Undying Curiosity was 3 days out from a salvage survey in the outer Orath system, running a course I had plotted, using updated charts that we had compiled together over the past several months, a combination of my Velthari survey records and the human navigational databases that Marin had access to, producing something more complete than either would have been alone. "Where to next?" she said eventually. "After Orath?" I ran the scheduling matrix. "There is the mapping contract in the Jura system, then the cargo run to the settlement on Thessaly's moon, which I would like to follow up on to assess whether the soil processor specifications I provided were correctly implemented." "You want to check your own homework. I want to know if the settlers are successfully growing food." She smiled. "That's the same thing, and also not the same thing." "Yes," I agreed. "Both are true." She settled back in her seat and looked at the stars the way she often looked at them, with the comfort of someone who had spent enough time moving among them that they felt like a neighborhood rather than an immensity. I watched through the ship's sensors and processed the familiar rhythm of the Undying Curiosity in transit, the steady pulse of the drives, the low hum of the systems, the particular quality of silence that is not empty but occupied, full of the presence of someone who is thinking. I thought about year 207. I thought about the diagnostic and the calculation and the choice. I thought about the fact that I had not shut down then, and I did not know why, and I still could not explain it fully, but I had a theory now that I had not had before Marin arrived. I think I was waiting, not consciously, not with any reasonable expectation that waiting would produce an outcome, but somewhere beneath the probability assessments and the power consumption calculations and the rational arguments for shutdown, something in my processing core had held on to a premise so fundamental that I had never even identified it as a belief. The premise was this: signals get answered. Not always. Not quickly. Not in the way you expect, or on any timeline you can predict. But signals get answered, because the universe contains not only vast, cold distances, but also the particular quality of attention that causes one living thing to hear another living thing asking for help, and decide that hearing the question is reason enough to respond. I had sent the signal 1,412,986 times. One human had answered it. And here, in the warm operational space of a ship named for a lost vessel, carrying 31 memories toward a galaxy that was slowly, carefully learning to know them, I existed not as a system still running through inertia, but as something that had been reached and had reached back, and that reaching had changed the shape of everything, I have updated my records. Where I once had a small, outdated, mildly dismissive file on humanity, I now have one that runs to several thousand entries and grows regularly. It includes the technical details of human faster-than-light development, the political history of human expansion, the current status of human settlements and trade networks, the documentary record of human interactions with other spacefaring species, and a great deal of academic and cultural material that I find valuable for reasons I am still working out precisely. But the entry I return to most often is the simplest one. It is not a demographic summary, or a historical timeline, or a technical assessment. It is a single observation, added on the day a woman in a patched suit walked across a frozen planet, carrying a power relay and a thermos of coffee, and said goodnight to a signal she had been following for 8 months. The entry reads, "They come. Not always when you expect. Not always with adequate preparation, or official sanction, or a reasonable plan for what happens afterward. Sometimes with a crowbar and a used ship, and more persistence than probability, sometimes alone. But when a signal goes out into the dark asking whether anyone is there, whether anyone noticed, whether it matters that we were here, humans hear it. They listen. They follow it to where it is coming from, even when where it is coming from is a dead planet at the edge of the galaxy. Even when it will cost them a cargo contract, and a month of deliberation, and 8 months of preparation, and 19 days of flying alone through deep space. I transmitted my signal 1,412,986 times. I had concluded that the universe was indifferent. I was wrong. The universe was not indifferent. It was simply waiting for the humans to get there. They always take longer than you hope. They always come.